I never thought my stepbrother would see me this way. Growing up, I never imagined my life would take such an unexpected turn. When my mom remarried after years of being single, I was happy for her. I was 18 at the time, about to leave for college, and the idea of having a new family felt strange, but not unwelcome. It wasn't until I met Josh, my new stepbrother, that things started to get complicated. Josh was 21, tall, with a quiet confidence that was both intimidating and intriguing. He had this piercing way of looking at people like he could see right through them. At first, we didn't talk much. We were polite, friendly, even, but there was this unspoken tension between us. I chalked it up to the awkwardness of blending families. After all, neither of us had asked for this situation. But everything changed the summer I came back home after my freshman year of college. My mom and Josh's dad had gone on a 2-week cruise to celebrate their anniversary, leaving the house to us. At first, it seemed like it would be fine. Josh and I had lived under the same roof before, but this time, something was different. There were no parents to diffuse the tension, no distractions to keep us apart. It was just the two of us, and the silence between us felt heavier than ever. On the third day, I was in the living room, curled up on the couch with a book, when Josh walked in. He glanced at me with his usual unreadable expression and sat down on the other end of the couch. "What are you reading?" he asked casually. I held up the book so he could see the cover. It was a romance novel, something light and fluffy to pass the time. Josh smirked. "Romance, huh? Didn't peg you as the type. And what type do you think I am?" I shot back, narrowing my eyes at him. He shrugged, leaning back into the couch. "I don't know. Quiet, maybe. Reserved." "That's not exactly a compliment," I said, crossing my arms. He chuckled, his voice low and warm. "Didn't mean it as an insult. Just an observation." The conversation shouldn't have stuck with me, but it did. For the rest of the day, I found myself thinking about Josh, about the way he had looked at me, like he was trying to figure me out. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to him than he let on, and for the first time, I started to wonder what it was. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I couldn't stop thinking about Josh. His words, his smirk, the way his presence seemed to fill the room, it all lingered in my mind. I told myself it was just the awkwardness of being home again, of sharing space with someone I barely knew. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. The next day, I tried to keep myself busy. I spent most of the morning outside, weeding the garden and trimming the overgrown hedges. The summer heat was relentless, and by noon, I was dripping with sweat. I went back inside, grabbed a glass of water, and headed upstairs to shower. As I reached the top of the stairs, I heard Josh's door open behind me. I turned to see him standing there, shirtless, his hair messy like he'd just woken up. For a moment, we just stared at each other, the silence between us stretching out. "Hot day," he said, his voice slightly rough from sleep. "Yeah," I managed to reply, my cheeks burning. I was just about to take a shower. Josh nodded, his eyes flicking to mine before quickly looking away.
"Right.
I'll leave you to it." I hurried into the bathroom, closing the door behind me and leaning against it. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I had no idea why. It wasn't like he'd done anything, but the way he'd looked at me, like he was trying to figure out what I was thinking, it left me feeling off balance. Later that evening, Josh and I ended up watching a movie together. It was something lighthearted, a comedy we both claimed to like. But as the minutes ticked by, I found it hard to focus. The couch suddenly felt too small, his presence too close. Every time he laughed or shifted beside me, my stomach fluttered in a way I didn't want to acknowledge. Halfway through the movie, he paused it and turned to me. "Can I ask you something?" he said, his tone unusually serious. "Sure," I said, though my chest tightened with nerves. "Do you feel weird about all this?" He gestured vaguely between us. "Living together, I mean. Just the two of us." I hesitated, unsure how to answer. "It's an adjustment," I admitted. "But no, not weird." "Why?" Josh leaned back, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know. I just feel like there's something between us. Like we're not just step-siblings or whatever." His words hung in the air, heavy and impossible to ignore. My heart was racing, and I didn't know how to respond. He was right, there was something between us. But admitting it felt like crossing a line we could never uncross. Josh, I started, but he cut me off. Look, I know it's not normal, but I can't help it. I feel something for you, and I don't know how to ignore it. Josh's confession hung in the air like a thundercloud, heavy and impossible to ignore. My mind raced, trying to process his words, but nothing made sense. I wanted to deny it, to tell him he was wrong, but the intensity in his eyes made it clear. He wasn't lying. I don't know what to say. I finally managed, my voice trembling. This is complicated. I know, Josh said, his tone soft but insistent. And I know it's a lot to take in. But I needed you to know how I feel. The room felt suffocating, the weight of his confession pressing down on me. Part of me wanted to run, to put as much distance between us as possible. But another part, the part that had been noticing him more and more, that couldn't stop thinking about the way he looked at me, kept me rooted in place. I need time to think, I whispered, unable to meet his gaze. Josh nodded, though I could see the flicker of disappointment in his eyes. Take all the time you need, he said. I'm not going anywhere. He stood up, giving me one last lingering look before heading upstairs to his room. As soon as he was gone, I let out a shaky breath, my hands trembling as I pressed them to my face. How had everything gotten so complicated so quickly? The next few days were a blur. Josh and I barely spoke, both of us dancing around the unspoken tension that had settled between us. It was exhausting, pretending like everything was normal when nothing felt normal anymore. I couldn't stop thinking about what he had said, about the way he had looked at me. But I also couldn't stop thinking about how it made me feel. Late one night, I found myself lying in bed, staring at the ceiling. Sleep felt impossible, my mind too crowded with thoughts of Josh. I tried to push them away, to remind myself that this was wrong. But the more I tried, the harder it became to ignore the truth. I liked the way he looked at me. I liked the way he made me feel, seen, wanted, alive. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. Around midnight, I heard a soft knock at my door. My heart skipped a beat, and I sat up, whispering, "Come in." The door creaked open, and Josh stepped inside, his expression hesitant. He was wearing a plain t-shirt and sweatpants, his hair tousled from sleep. "I couldn't sleep," he said quietly, stepping closer. "I kept thinking about us." "Josh," I started, but he shook his head. "Just let me say this," he said, his voice raw. "I know this is messy, and I know it's not what either of us planned. But I can't pretend like I don't feel something for you. And I don't think you can either." My breath caught in my throat, his words cutting through all the noise in my mind. He was right. As much as I wanted to deny it, I couldn't. There was something between us, something I couldn't ignore. "I'm scared," I admitted, my voice barely audible. "Me too," Josh said, stepping closer until he was standing right in front of me. "But we don't have to figure it all out tonight. Just tell me I'm not alone in this." I hesitated, the weight of his words pressing down on me. But as I looked into his eyes, I realized I couldn't lie, not to him, and not to myself. "You're not alone," I whispered. Josh let out a shaky breath, his hand reaching out to cup my cheek. The warmth of his touch sent a shiver through me, and before I could think, he leaned in, his lips brushing against mine. The kiss was soft, tentative, as if he was waiting for me to pull away. But I didn't. Instead, I found myself leaning into him, my hands resting lightly on his chest. For a moment, it felt like time had stopped. There was no one else in the world but us, and I couldn't bring myself to care about what it meant or what would happen next. All I knew was that I didn't want this moment to end. The kiss changed everything. After that night, there was no going back. Josh and I tried to act normal, but the tension between us was impossible to ignore. Every glance, every accidental touch, every shared moment felt charged with an intensity that left me breathless. One afternoon, I was in the kitchen, preparing lunch, when Josh walked in. He leaned against the counter, watching me as I worked. "Do you ever think about what happens if they find out?" he asked, his voice quiet. "All the time," I admitted, my hands trembling as I chopped vegetables. But that doesn't change how I feel. Josh stepped closer, his hand brushing against mine. The simple touch sent a jolt through me, and I couldn't help but look up at him. "Me neither," he said, his voice low. "But we need to be careful." "I know," I said, though the words felt hollow. Being careful didn't feel like enough, not when every moment we spent together only made me want more. That evening, our parents announced they would be going out for dinner, leaving the house to us. As soon as they were gone, the tension between Josh and me boiled over. We were sitting on the couch, pretending to watch a movie, but neither of us was paying attention. The silence between us was heavy, and I could feel my pulse quicken as Josh shifted closer. "I can't do this anymore," he said suddenly, his voice raw. I turned to him, my heart racing. "What do you mean?" "This," he said, gesturing between us. "Pretending like nothing's changed. I want to be with you. I don't care what anyone thinks." His words hit me like a freight train, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. "Josh, we can't." "Yes, we can," he interrupted, his voice firm. "We just have to stop being afraid." I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, but the intensity in his eyes stopped me. Instead, I found myself leaning closer, my resolve crumbling under the weight of my feelings. "Then show me," I whispered. Josh didn't hesitate. He closed the distance between us, his lips capturing mine in a kiss that was both tender and urgent. His hand slid to my waist, pulling me closer, and I melted into him, losing myself in the moment. The kiss deepened, and I felt every shred of hesitation melt away. Josh's hands rested on my waist, his touch firm but gentle, as though he was afraid I might pull away. But I didn't. I couldn't. Every fiber of my being wanted to be closer to him, to feel the connection that had been building between us for weeks. As our lips parted, I stared at him, breathless and overwhelmed. His eyes searched mine, looking for a sign that I regretted what had just happened. But regret was the furthest thing from my mind. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, his voice filled with concern. I nodded, though my heart was racing.
"Yeah.
This feels right," he finished for me, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "It feels right." I didn't respond. I didn't have to. The truth was written all over my face, and Josh knew it. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway broke the spell. Our parents were home. Josh quickly stood, running a hand through his hair as he glanced toward the window. "We'll talk later," he said, his voice low but steady. I nodded, my stomach twisting in knots as I tried to compose myself. The door opened moments later, and our parents walked in, laughing and chatting about their evening. Josh and I acted as though nothing had happened, but the tension between us lingered, like a secret only we could see. Over the next few days, the stolen moments between us became more frequent. A brush of his hand against mine as we passed in the hallway. A lingering glance across the dinner table. Late-night conversations that ended with whispered promises and soft, fleeting kisses. It was intoxicating, and I found myself craving his presence more and more. But with every stolen moment, the weight of what we were doing grew heavier. I couldn't stop the nagging voice in the back of my mind that kept reminding me how risky this was. One evening, while our parents were out running errands, Josh and I found ourselves alone in the living room. The tension between us was palpable, and I could feel my pulse quicken as he sat down beside me. "We can't keep doing this," I said, though my voice trembled with uncertainty. Josh frowned, his gaze locking onto mine. "What do you mean?" "This," I said, gesturing between us. "Sneaking around.
Hiding."
It's not sustainable." Josh reached out, taking my hand in his. The warmth of his touch sent a shiver through me, and I couldn't bring myself to pull away. "I know it's not easy," he said softly, "but I don't want to lose this. I don't want to lose you." His words hit me like a tidal wave, and I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. "Josh, I don't want to lose you either. But what happens when they find out? When this all comes crashing down?" He squeezed my hand, his thumb brushing gently over my knuckles. "Then we figure it out. Together." The following weekend, our parents announced they would be heading out of town for an overnight trip. As soon as they left, the air between Josh and me shifted. For the first time in weeks, we didn't have to pretend. We didn't have to hide. That evening, we found ourselves in the kitchen, cooking dinner together. The atmosphere was light and playful, a welcome change from the tension that had been hanging over us. Josh stood behind me as I chopped vegetables, his hands resting lightly on my hips. "You're terrible at this," he teased, his breath warm against my neck. "Excuse me?" I shot back, laughing. "I'm an excellent cook." "Sure you are," he said, his voice laced with sarcasm. "Just don't cut your finger off." I turned to face him, rolling my eyes. "You're impossible." Josh grinned, his hands sliding to my waist as he leaned in. "And you love it." I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could, his lips captured mine in a kiss that stole the breath from my lungs. His hands tightened on my waist, pulling me closer, and I felt my heart race as I melted into him. The sound of the timer on the oven broke the moment, and we pulled apart, both of us laughing softly. "Dinner's ready," I said, my cheeks flushed. "Later," Josh whispered, his eyes dark with promise. After dinner, we ended up on the couch, the glow of the TV casting soft shadows across the room. Josh's arm was draped casually over my shoulders, and I leaned into him, savoring the warmth of his touch. "This feels normal," I said quietly, breaking the comfortable silence. Josh nodded, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on my arm. "It does." "It should." I tilted my head to look at him, my heart swelling with affection. "Do you think we'll ever have this? For real, without having to hide?" He hesitated, his expression thoughtful. "I don't know, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to find out." His words filled me with a strange mix of hope and fear. I wanted to believe him, to trust that we could make this work. But the reality of our situation was impossible to ignore. Later that night, as we lay tangled together on the couch, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't felt in weeks. Josh's hand was warm against my back, his breathing steady and comforting. "I don't want this to end," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "It doesn't have to," he said softly, pressing a kiss to my forehead. I closed my eyes, letting his words wash over me. For the first time in a long time, I felt like everything might actually be okay. The morning after that quiet night on the couch, reality came crashing back. Our parents were due to return later in the day, and the peaceful bubble Josh and I had created was about to burst. We both knew it, but neither of us wanted to acknowledge it. As I stood in the kitchen making coffee, Josh walked in, his hair tousled from sleep. He leaned against the counter, watching me in silence for a moment before speaking. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice soft but heavy with meaning. I hesitated, my hands trembling as I poured coffee into 2 mugs. "We go back to pretending, I guess," I said, though the words felt like a knife twisting in my chest. Josh frowned, his jaw tightening. "I hate this," he admitted. "I hate hiding. I hate pretending like what we have doesn't matter." His words sent a pang through my heart, and I turned to face him. "Josh, I don't want to hide either. But what choice do we have? If they find out..." He stepped closer, his eyes locked onto mine. "Then we deal with it. Together." The intensity in his gaze left me breathless, and I found myself nodding despite my fears. "Okay," I whispered. "Together." That afternoon, our parents returned, bringing with them the usual noise and energy that filled the house when they were home. Josh and I did our best to act normal, but the tension between us was impossible to ignore. Every glance, every accidental touch, felt like a secret waiting to be exposed. A few days later, everything came to a head. It was late in the evening, and I was in the living room, curled up with a book. Josh's dad walked in, looking tired but content, and sat down across from me. "You and Josh seem to be getting along well," he said, his tone casual. I froze, my heart racing. Yeah," I said, forcing a smile. "We've been spending a lot of time together." He nodded, his eyes narrowing slightly. "That's good. I was worried it might be awkward with us all living under one roof, but you two seem to have figured it out." "Yeah," I said again, my voice shaky. "It's been fine." He didn't say anything else, but the look in his eyes made my stomach churn. Did he suspect something? Was he testing me? I couldn't be sure, but the fear that he might know sent my mind spinning. That night, I went to bed feeling uneasy. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to go wrong. Around midnight, I heard a soft knock at my door. My heart skipped a beat as I sat up and whispered, "Come in." Josh slipped inside, his expression tense. "Can we talk?" I nodded, scooting over to make room for him on the bed. He sat down, running a hand through his hair. "I think he knows," he said, his voice low. I felt my stomach drop.
What? How?
"I don't know," Josh admitted, "but he's been watching us. The way he looks at me, it's like he's trying to figure something out." My mind raced, panic bubbling up inside me. "What do we do?" Josh reached out, taking my hand in his. "We stick to the plan. We're careful. We don't give him any reason to suspect anything." I nodded, though my chest felt tight with fear. "Okay." Over the next few weeks, the tension in the house grew unbearable. Josh and I avoided being alone together as much as possible, but it was clear that his dad was watching us closely. Every glance, every question felt like a test, and I was constantly on edge. Then one evening, everything came crashing down. We were all sitting in the living room, watching a movie, when Josh's dad turned to him and said, "Can I talk to you for a minute?" Josh tensed, his jaw tightening as he nodded. They stepped into the hallway, and I could hear their voices, low and serious. My heart pounded in my chest as I strained to hear what they were saying. After a few minutes, Josh returned, his expression unreadable. He sat down next to me, but he didn't say anything. I wanted to ask what had happened, but I didn't dare. Not with his dad sitting across from us, his eyes watching our every move. Later that night, Josh came to my room, his face pale and drawn. "He knows," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. My heart stopped. "What do you mean?" "He didn't say it outright, but he knows. He said we need to talk tomorrow. All of us." Panic surged through me, and I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. "Josh, what are we going to do?" He pulled me into his arms, holding me tightly. "We tell them the truth," he said. "It's the only way." I wanted to argue, to tell him there had to be another way, but deep down, I knew he was right. We couldn't keep hiding. It was time to face the consequences of what we had done. The next day, we sat down with our parents and told them everything. The room was silent as we spoke, their faces a mixture of shock, anger, and disbelief. When we finished, Josh's dad stood up, his expression hard. "I need time to process this," he said, his voice cold. My mom didn't say anything, but the disappointment in her eyes was enough to make my chest ache. They left the room, leaving Josh and me sitting in silence. For a long time, neither of us said anything. Then Josh reached out, taking my hand in his. "No matter what happens," he said softly, "we'll get through this. Together." I nodded, though my heart felt heavy with uncertainty. Whatever came next, we would face it together. Because despite everything, despite the fear and the consequences, what we had was real. And that was worth fighting for.